We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis in Meseches Moed Kattan. This is Moed Kattan Daf 13b. The Gemara says, V'atanya, we have a brisa that supports what we said on the previous Amud. The brisa says as follows: Mevi'in kalim mi beis ha'uman. You're allowed to bring kalim from the house of the craftsman on Chol HaMoed. Kagon kad mi beis hakadar, for example, a jug from the manufacturer of the jugs. V'chos mi beis hazagog, and a cup from the person who makes glass. Avalot semer mi beis hatzav, avalot kalim mi beis ha'uman. But you're not allowed to bring wool from the house of the dyer. You're not allowed to bring kalim from the house of the craftsman. Rashi over here explains, V'atanya siyua, this brisa is to support what we said on the previous Amud. Kad v'kos l'tzorech ha'moed hein. So first, the brisa is starting off saying that a kad, like a jug and a kos and a cup, that's for the moed. That everybody agrees you're allowed to bring it home. Avol semer v'kalim ein tzorech ha'moed. But when it comes to semer and kalim, not needed for the moed, so that the brisa initially says you're not allowed to bring those. And then the brisa continues, V'mein lo mayochal. Now let's say the craftsman doesn't have what to eat. Nosin lo scharo. Then you can give him his wages. Umanicho etzlo. And these items that you don't need for the moed, you have to leave by the craftsman. V'meinu ma'aminu. Now if you don't trust the craftsman, manicho bebayis hasamachlo. Then you can leave it in the house near the craftsman. V'mchoshish lahem shema yignevu. Now if you're afraid they're going to get stolen, mefan l'chatzar acheres. Bring him to another chatzar. V'meinu ma'aminu. If you don't trust the other chatzar, mevion bitzina besoch beis. So he can bring it privately to his house. A little bit of a question in the gears over here, whether you include the parentheses, but the point essentially is the same, that if you don't trust the individual, then you can bring it home. Rashi over here says, V'mein lo le'uman mayochal nosin lo scharo. If the uman doesn't have what to eat, you give him his wages. Mefanan l'chatzar acheres, v'meinu ma'aminu b'chatzar acheres. If it's not trustworthy, it's not reliable in the other chatzar, mevi'in l'soch beis, so he can bring it to his house. Alma, you see from this is the whole point of bringing this brisa, b'she'eno ma'amino mevi'in, that we make a distinction, and we say that when you don't trust the person, so then you can bring it, and otherwise you cannot bring it, and that answers the contradiction between our Mishnah and the Mishnah Psachim. Again, the Mishnah Psachim said you're allowed to bring kalim from the Beis HaUman. Our Mishnah said you're not allowed to bring kalim from the Beis HaUman, so we answer the contradiction in this fashion. In one case, we're talking about where you trust the Uman. Other case, we're talking about where you do not trust the Uman. And so the Gemara continues, Tirtzas Mevi'in. So with this answer, you've answered up the contradiction in terms of whether you can bring the kalim from the Beis HaUman to your house. You've answered up. It depends whether you trust the Uman or not. But Molichin Kasha, but what about taking it to the Uman? That's still a contradiction. Rashi over here says, Molichin Kasha de Katani, because it says, now the gears over here is changed to de Katani b'psachim. De Psachim, it says in the Mishnah in Psachim, de Pa'amim Molichin, it says you are allowed to take it to the Uman. Umasnisin de Hacha Katani ein Mevi'in. Now our Mishnah says you're not allowed to bring it from the Uman. Kol shekein de ein Molichin. Certainly you're not allowed to bring it to the Uman. So therefore we have a contradiction here. You're not, according to our Mishnah, you're not allowed to bring it to the Uman. According to the Mishnah Psachim, you are allowed to bring it to the Uman. Now you can't say the answer is that you don't trust the Molichin ma'im ma'amino shaykh, because if you're bringing it to the Uman, there's nothing to talk about in terms of trusting or not trusting. You can't give that answer. So that's why the Gemara says Molichin is a kasha. And the Gemara explains, the Katani ain't Mevi'in, because it says in our Mishnah you're not allowed to bring it from the Uman. Certainly our Mishnah is saying you can't take it to the Uman. So therefore, again, we have this contradiction. And therefore the Gemara says, you have to reject the answer. It's not proper to answer that the difference between our Mishnah and the Mishnah Psachim is whether you trust the Uman. That's not going to work for Molichin. Rather, you have to give the answer we gave originally, as Rashi over here says, Kedeshanya Meikara can be Arba Aser. The Mishnah Psachim is not talking about a Chol HaMoed. It's talking about on the 14th of Nisan, meaning on Erev Pesach. So there is where you have permission to bring it to and from the Uman, Kan B'chol Shel Moed, but our Mishnah is talking about Chol HaMoed. That's where it's going to be problematic. The Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Mechaben es haktsios bekash. You're allowed to cover up the figs that are laid out to dry. You're allowed to cover them up with straw. Rabbi Yehuda says, Af ma'avin. You're even allowed to do it in a thick manner. That will be discussed in the Gemara. Mochrei peros ksus v'kelim, those who are selling fruits or clothing or vessels, mochrim b'tzina, l'tzorach hamoed, they're allowed to sell privately for use on the holiday, if it's going to be used on the holiday. Hatzayodin v'adeshushos v'agrusos, the tzayodin are those who trap animals, could be fishermen. The shushos are those who thresh, and grusos, those who grind up beans. Osim b'tzina, they did their work privately. L'tzorach hamoed, again, for use on the holiday. Rabbi Yossi says, hey mechmiru al atzma, they were actually strict on themselves, and they would not work on Chol HaMoed. Rashi over here says, Mechapin is mechasin, again covering up the figs that are laid out to dry. You want to protect them from the rain. Hadeshushos shadoshin v'koshin chitin l'daisa, those are the people they thresh and they crush up the wheat. V'agrusos shatochen and pon l'grisen, those are the people that grind up the beans. Bitzina, so they can do it privately. Shema yomru zelo keach shelo l'tzorach hamoed. The reason why they're supposed to sell privately and do things privately is people are going to say, oh, they're buying for the, maybe people will think that they're buying not for the purpose of the holiday, so therefore we don't want people to think that, so it's better that they do it privately. The Gemara says, Pligi bar Rabbi Chia bar Abba v'Rabbi Asi, there's a machlokus between Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Asi, which are vayu mishmei de Chizki v'Rabbi Yochanan. Both are quoting Chizki and Rabbi Yochanan, the following machlokus. Chad Amar mechapen. One says that the word mechapen means a klushe. It means you cover it up in a thin manner. And ma'aven asmuche. Ma'aven means you really fully cover it up in a thick manner. The other one says, no, mechapen bein aklushi bein asmuchi. The word mechapen can mean whether you do it thin or thick. That word can have both meanings. And ma'avin, what does the word ma'avin mean? It means osa kamin kri. You make it as if it's a pile. Rashi over here says, aklushe first means shemechaseu ba'anofim miruchakin. That means that you take some branches, they're distant from each other. It's not a full covering. The lo have a kisei gomer. That means it's not a full covering. That means you take the branches that you're using to cover up the figs and you put them very close to one another to have a kisui gomer. That's a full-fledged kisui. And finally, what's kimin kri? Mechansin osan biyacha. That means you gather them all together into a pile. Kadesh yu nochen lechasos. That makes it easier to cover up. So that's the highest level, is you do it kimin kri. So the machlokas over here, what exactly does mechapen mean, and what exactly does ma'avin mean? Again, one opinion says mechapen means you cover it thin, ma'avin means thick. The other one says mechapen means any kind of covering, thin or thick, and ma'avin means to say that you do it like a kri, you do it like a pile, you put them close together. The Gemara says, Tanya nami hachi, we have brisa that supports this as well. Ma'avin means osa kamin kri. You make it like a pile, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, mochrei peiros ksus v'kelim mochrei betzin. Instead of those who sell the fruits and the garments and the vessels, they should do it privately. So the Gemara says, Ibaylu, they had the following question. Hein hechmiru al atzmon delo have avdi klal. What does it mean at the end of the Mishnah? It says, Rabbi Yossi says, the people at the end of the Mishnah, it says they were strict on themselves and they didn't do this. Does it mean to say they didn't do it at all? Or maybe it means these individuals who used to do this work, they would do it, but they would do it on Chol Hamoed, but they would do it privately. And so the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here the following proof. Mochrei peiros ksus v'kelim. It says that those who sold fruits and the garments and the vessels, mochrin betzina letzorach hamoed, they sold privately for the sake of the holiday. Rabbi Yossi says, Tagori Tiveria, the merchants of Tiveria, hein hechmiru al atzman shelo yu mochrin kolikar. They were strict on themselves, they didn't do it at all. And it says further, tzidei chayos v'ofos v'dogim, those who trapped wild animals and birds and fish, tzadin betzina letzorach hamoed, they would do it privately, they would trap privately for the sake of the moed. Rabbi Yossi says, Tzidei Akko, those of Akko, the trappers of Akko, hein hechmiru al atzman, they were strict on themselves, shelo yu tzadin kol ikar, that they didn't trap at all. And the Brisa continues, the Shushay Chilka, Targis, Vitisne, these are the people, they make groats again out of the wheat, they crack it open. So these are different kinds of groats called Chilka, Targis, and Tisne. Doshish and Betzina, they would thresh privately, Letzorach HaMoed, for use on the holiday. And Rabbi Yossi says, the Shushay Tzipore, those who did this in Tzipore, the groat makers of Tzipore, Hein Hechamiru al Atzman, they were strict on themselves, Shelo Yudoshin Kalikar, they would not make these groats at all on Chol HaMoed. So you see clearly in this Brisa, Rabbi Yossi, when he says Hein Hechamiru al Atzman, it means they're strict on themselves, not to do it at all. The Gemara continues, Amar Abaya says, Chilka Chodel Tarti, Targis Chodel Tzlos, Tisni Chodel Arba. And when we talk about chilka, again, that's a kind of groats. It's made from wheat. So what that means to say is you take a kernel of wheat, you take one kernel and you break it into two pieces. Targis is you take one kernel and you break it into three pieces. And tisni is you take one kernel and you break it into four pieces. Kiyasar Rav Dimi Amar kunsa. When Rav Dimi came, he said that chilka is actually kunsa. Kunsa is a kind of wheat. It's called emer wheat. So the Gemara says, Meisve, we have a question from the following Brisa. Chilka, targis, v'tisni, tamein, b'chol makom. The Brisa says, chilka, targis, and tisni are tamei. So the Gemara says, Bishlam alaman damar chadel tarti litzlas ve'uli arba. I understand according to Abaya, who says that chilka and targis and tisni, it's just you're actually processing the wheat, you're breaking it into one or two or three, into two or three or four pieces. Mishum hachi tamein b'chol makom. That's why it's tamei. This kasher, because it certainly touched liquid. It had a hechsher l'kabel tum. In other words, when you're processing the wheat, if you're already breaking it into pieces, you definitely rinse the wheat kernels. Once you rinse the kernels, so then the halach is if they touch water, now they're prepared to be makabel. It makes sense. But according to Rav Dimi, who says that chilka just refers to a kind of wheat and it's not even processed, so why should that be tamei? Halo is kasher. It hasn't received the hechsher l'kabel tum. It hasn't been prepared to be makabel tum because it hasn't touched any liquid, it hasn't touched any water. And so the Gemara says, no, kegon de mekalfan. When he said it was kunsa, he doesn't mean it's unprocessed. He means mekalfan, it was peeled. What it really means is that you removed the husk of the wheat. The ilav the sharlu b'mai. If not for the fact that you soak it in water first, lo have a mekalf. It's impossible to remove the husk of the wheat. And therefore, again, that also is prepared to be mekabel tumah. Now, why is it called chilka? The shakal chilkayu, it's exactly what it means. It means you took off the husk of the wheat. The Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question from the following brisa. The brisa says, Hanoder min hadogan, if somebody takes a neder not to derive any benefit from dogan, from grain, so aser af bepul ha-mitzri yavesh is going to be aser even from the dry Egyptian bean, meaning that's considered grain. But umutter balach is going to be mutter to have the fresh bean, the one that's not dried out, that's not considered grain. Umutter ba'orez, he's also allowed to have rice, bechilka, v'targas, v'tisni, and he's also allowed to have what we're discussing above, chilka, targas, and tisni. So bishlama leman damar chadal tarti, chadal tlas, v'chadal arba. I understand if you say that chilka, targas, and tisni means you're taking the kernel and you're breaking it into 2 or 3 or 4. So shaper, this makes sense. The nafku lehumi toras dagon, because it's no longer considered grain. Once you break the kernel, it's not called grain. Elamandam or kunsa, but again, according to the one who says kunsa, which is just a kind of wheat, so dagan ma'alyu, it seems to be regular grain. Why should you be permitted if you were noder min dagan? And the Gemara says to that kasha, that is indeed difficult. And the Gemara continues, Rav Huna shara lehu lahanu krufyasa. Rav Huna allowed the krufyasa, which are people who sell spices, lemeza lezvuni ki orchayu b'shukah. He said you can sell in the normal fashion in the marketplace on Chol Moed. Gemara says, Eisvei Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana asks, it says, Chanos psucha l'stav. If you have a store that's opened up to a bunch of pillars, meaning it's not opened up directly into Rosh Hashanah, so posech v'noa kedarko. You're allowed to open it and close it in the normal fashion on Chol Moed. But psucha l'Rosh Hashanah, but if it's opened up to Rosh Hashanah, right to the public, so posech achas v'noa lachas. You could open one door, but you should close the other door, meaning don't sell in the normal fashion. The Erev Yom Tov Achron Shel Chag, but on Erev Yom Tov of the last day of Yom Tov of Sukkot, so then already Motziu Ma'ater Shukei Ha'ir Bepeiros, you're allowed to take out, open up the store and adorn the marketplaces of the city with fruits. B'shvil Kavod Yom Tov Achron. That's because it's an honor for the last day of Yom Tov. You're taking out all these fruits in honor of the last day of Yom Tov, but on the other days of Chol Moed, it's going to be problematic. So it says, they covered Yontif Achronin, so it's only because of the honor of the last day of Yontif. But Shalomim, they covered Yontif Lo. But if you're not doing it for that, if it's on the other days of Chol Moed, apparently you're not allowed to sell in the normal manner. So that's the Kashan Rav Huna, who allowed the people who were selling spices to sell in the normal manner. So the Gemara answers, Lokash, it's not difficult. Habit piri, habit tavlin. It depends if you're talking about fruits. It depends if you're talking about spices. Rashi over here says, habit piri sheyesh lachsha shekonu letzorach yimos hashana. By fruits, people might be buying for other times of the year. They might not be buying for the moed. People will be suspicious of that. But betavlin, by spices, mocher kedarka, gon kruv, v'karshinan, hakol yodin, to letzorach hamoed. And everyone knows that when you're buying these items, it's letzorach hamoed, when it's tavlin, when it's spices, v'lekach shada, there's not going to be any suspicion, she'ein ru'uyin l'skayim, it's not the kind of things that last for a long time. Hilka chafila befarhesia mutter. That's why it's even permitted to sell befarhesia. Hadran alach mishahafach. This is the end of the second parak of Meseches Moed Kattan. If you're enjoying this channel and these videos, please like, share, and subscribe. And please take a look at the description box below to see how you can support this channel. And we will now begin the third parak of Meseches Moed Kattan. The Mishnah says, V'yelu megalchin b'moed. The following individuals are allowed to shave on Chol Moed. Rashi over here says, some of these individuals have an onus. It was impossible for them to take a haircut before the Moed, therefore they have special permission to do so on Chol Moed. Somebody who comes from across the sea, a long journey, somebody is released from captivity, and someone who gets out of prison, somebody who was ostracized from the community, and the Chachamim now allowed him back into the community. Somebody, let's say, had a neder that he wasn't going to shave, but now he asked the Chacham, and the Chacham undid the neder, undid the oath. Now he's suddenly allowed to shave on Chol Moed. He wasn't able to do so beforehand, so he also is allowed to shave. V'hanazir, and also a nazir, v'hamitzora, and a mitzora, mitumaso l'taharasa, who are going from being impure to being pure. Rashi over here says, mitumaso l'taharasa, nazir tameh. We're talking about here a nazir who's tameh. Kisha'ala mitumaso, when he becomes pure, v'shuv eino meshamer nizro, so he's no longer keeping his nazirus umegaleach, and so now he's going to shave. V'chein mitzora, similarly by a mitzora, by someone with leprosy, she'ala mitumaso, who is now purifying himself, megaleach beregel. So in that process, he's allowed to shave on the regel if he shalohayolehem penai legaleach kodem haregel, because these individuals again were not able to shave before the regel. So these again the nazir and the mitzora who are in the process of purifying themselves from tumah, so they are also allowed to shave on the moed. And the Mishnah continues, ve'elu mechabsin b'moed. The following individuals are allowed to do laundry on Chol Moed. Again, similar, Habami Medina Sayam, somebody who comes from across the sea, couldn't do so before the Moed. And somebody who comes from captivity and he was released, or somebody was released from prison. We'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Daled Amud Aleph.